The origin story of this event lies in the October 15th designation of Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network as a so-called terrorist entity by the Canadian and US governments. In the context of the Palestine Solidarity Movement in North America, this was an escalation of state repression aimed at a pillar of the left and pro-resistance wing of the movement, and at an organization that could not, with any kind of credibility, be accused of material support for armed factions in Palestine, but was clearly targeted purely for its political line and leadership. I want to start my presentation tonight by unpacking that designation a bit, putting it into two historical contexts: the context of the targeting of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement and the context of repression against Palestine solidarity in Canada over the last 13 months, and then sharing some thoughts on the purpose of terror designations and state repression more generally. For those who haven't seen it, the video of Charlotte Capes from the 2011 Red Sparks Union event on criminalizing people's struggles, and we can drop that into the chat. I'm going to pull a lot of analysis here, but can't cover all the ground that she does in the video, so I really recommend it. And the other videos from that event are also get great background on this topic. The Palestinian Liberation Movement has historically been used as the testing ground for terrorism designations, and therefore gives us the best case study on how these designations have been used by the Anglo-American imperialist alliance since the 1990s as an axe to try to decapitate revolutionary political activity and as a lever to try to steer mass political opinion and affiliation. In the post-Oslo Accords period, the late 1990s, this meant designating every Palestinian political faction that rejected the capitulation of the Oslo Accords as a terrorist entity, trying to sever these organizations from their significant political and economic base in the Palestinian diaspora and to sideline them while incorporating the Palestinian comprador elites into the imperialist order as a security subcontractor for the Israeli occupation. Other revolutionary groups were targeted in the 1997 terror list, but it's clear from their preponderance on the list and its subsequent implementation that the imperialist agenda in Palestine was to be the test case for implementing these new efforts to develop an international regime of repression. Then after September 11th, 2001, the so-called War on Terror gave the US the political platform to export its model of criminalizing liberation movements to its Anglo-American imperialist allies, Canada, Australia, and the UK, and to a lesser extent, its European and Chinese rivals. At this point, they also adopted the strategy of purposely mixing up popular anti-imperialist movements with well-financed and often state-linked reactionary organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Colombian paramilitaries in order to sow confusion about the meaning of the list. And of course, once the infrastructure of repression was created, the cops were only too happy to apply it. For example, against the West Coast Warriors Society as the first group targeted under Canada's 2002 Anti-Terrorism Act, and in the crackdown on the support of diasporic Tamil communities for their national liberation struggle in the late 2000s, just to name a couple of instances. Based on my own experience, this imperialist strategy was highly successful. It dissuaded many diaspora communities connected to national liberation struggles from being actively involved in those efforts or from vocalizing their support for them. It created a barrier to activists and prospective revolutionaries developing relationships and learning from advanced revolutionary movements in the oppressed nations. And it made material support, something that had been a normal component of solidarity work previously, impossible. Keeping the consciousness of revolutionary struggles and their significant breakthroughs alive among the masses in the 2000s and 2010s was a real challenge. And it's a testimony to the steadfastness of the Palestinian people and the resilience of the Palestinian liberation movement that despite the best efforts of the whole Anglo-American imperialist alliance, they have rebuilt their unity, their institutions of struggle, and their mass base of political support, even here in the belly of the beast. And the listing of Samidoun was at least to some degree a response to that organization's effectiveness in breaking through the political barriers erected by the War on Terror. in consistently and fearlessly raising the standard of the Palestinian and regional resistance forces, naming them PFLP, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, calling for freedom for Palestinians jailed by the occupation, and highlighting important revolutionary leaders like Ahmad Sadat, George Ibrahim Abdallah, and Khalida Jarrar. The second thing I want to look at is the designation of Samidoun in the context of the Canadian ruling class and political establishment's efforts to contain the surging Palestine solidarity movement since October 7th, 2023. The mass movement in response to the genocide in Gaza and in solidarity with Palestine has exposed a profound disconnect between the political positions of a broad section of the Canadian people, likely an absolute majority who at a minimum support Palestinian human rights and aspirations for self-determination, and the position of the entire ruling class and its political establishment, including all the major political parties, who want to preserve Israel as the reliable military outpost of Anglo-American imperialism in the heart of the Arab world at any cost, especially if the cost is paid in Palestinian lives. This disconnect has led the Canadian government and state to use a dual strategy to try to contain the Palestine solidarity movement. On the one hand, fake humanitarian gestures and rhetoric to try to placate the mass concern over the undeniable genocide. And on the other hand, repression, very specifically targeted at people, particularly community leaders and leaders in the movement, who have the courage to go beyond the rhetoric of humanitarianism and ceasefire, and who explicitly uphold the Palestinian resistance and national liberation struggle. United in Struggle had an early firsthand experience of this as our co-chair of our organization, Natalie Knight, was suspended, then fired from her teaching job at Langara over a speech she gave on October 28th, 2023, upholding Operation Al-Aqsa Flood as an amazing and brilliant act of resistance. There are many other examples here, other firings and job suspensions, hate speech charges for carrying a PFLP flag in Toronto, forced dissolution of an anti-racism committee, and always that implantation of, is saying what I really think going to get me fired or arrested? But let's just follow the thread of Samidoun because it has been among the most targeted precisely because between October 7th, 2023 and October 15th, 2024, it was among the most visible organizations articulating a clear political line in support of Palestinian resistance and national liberation. So on April 26th, just as the Solidarity Movement was entering a new phase with militant student actions sweeping across the US, Canadian, and European universities, Charlotte Cates, the founder of Samidoun, was arrested, charged with incitement of hate, and given conditions of release preventing her from attending or speaking at any public gathering until October 8th, 2024, an explicit attempt to remove her leadership from the movement. And while, when October 8th rolled around, the lower levels of the Canadian legal apparatus refused to do entirely away with civil liberties and due process and wouldn't proceed with the charges in court, the more direct puppets of the ruling class were already preparing a follow-up. The designation of Samidoun as a terrorist entity backed by a completely unsubstantiated claim of direct links to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the actually ridiculous characterization of Samidoun as having some kind of fundraising function for the resistance. The October 15th designation had an immediate impact on the movement locally, and I suspect in other Canadian centers, demobilizing and empowering a pre-existing conservative element to censure discussion of Palestinian resistance and the actual role of Canadian imperialism in supporting Israeli war crimes and genocide. And the Canadian state's persecution of Charlotte ramped up as they froze her bank account and on November 14th, violently raided her East Van apartment, breaking down the door, throwing in a flash grenade, dragging her out in her bare feet, crashing the apartment and needlessly breaking the bedroom window, and confiscating her electronics, all on a warrant for conspiracy to incite hate, a lesser charge than the one they had already failed on, and for events at a rally in Vancouver that occurred while Charlotte was not even in the country. In the targeting of Samidoun, we can see very clearly the purpose of designations and other forms of state repression. First and foremost, to disconnect militant organizations and leaders from their mass base and to create an example that will intimidate and deter the masses from joining or engaging with those organizations. It's important to understand that they use the tactics of criminalization, terrorist designation, and incarceration as alternatives to other options like mass roundups or attacking demonstrations or banning gatherings, precisely because they want to avoid these types of civil conflicts in which the masses are actually involved, which can easily turn into qualitative leaps forward for resistance and mass struggle. Their goal is to set back and demobilize our mass movements by neutralizing our leaders and detaching large parts of the base who have not yet been steeled in struggle and prepared for repression. And if they can't do it with criminalization and imprisonment, then they try to do it with murder, like they did with Louis Riel, Ginger Goodwin, Anna Mae Aquash, and Maewa Singh, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther Jr., Joe Hill and the Haymarket Martyrs, James Connolly, Karl Liebknecht, and Rosa Luxemburg, Victor Jara, Che Guevara, and Salvador Allende, Bhagat Singh and Gian Saibaba, Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara, Benito and Wilma Tiamzon, and Ghassan Kanafani, Abu Ali Mustafa, Yahya al-Sinwar, and Saeed Hassan Nasrallah, and too many more. So if we're going to organize for real change, revolutionary change, we need to look repression straight in the face and take inspiration from these martyrs who paid the ultimate price for their political conviction and courage. We also need to be strategic, unnecessary sacrifice, and actions that escalate the contradictions with the state when we're not prepared to defend ourselves from the inevitable repression don't benefit our cause. Escalation should come when we reach a quantitative threshold of organizing and consolidation that allows us to take a qualitative leap in struggle. So I'm going to hand things off to my co-presenters now and come back to present some thoughts on how we as organizations and movements can be prepared to confront state repression more effectively.
Great. Thank you, Ioannis. We'll now hear from Gord Hill, our second presenter. Welcome, Gord. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, yeah, thanks for organizing this and having me speak at it. So I was going to talk about the Anti-Terrorism Act and some aspects of how it's affected Indigenous resistance or how the state represses Indigenous movements. But before I start talking about the Anti-Terrorism Act, I thought I would try to give like a bit of history context for this type of state legislation repression. So before we had the Anti-Terrorism Act, back in the day, we had the War Measures Act, which was used in World War I and World War II and during the 1970 October crisis. And the War Measures Act is basically the imposing of martial law over Canada, in which the state took control of and imposed like a wartime economy. They took over industrial production. They decided what would be produced and how much would be produced. They took control of housing, had rent control. All types of aspects of society were they gave themselves the authority to take and expropriate, land, vehicles, and whatever. And one thing I found interesting about this was after the 1917 Russian Revolution, they actually added some new regulations to the War Measures Act that had been enacted in 1914 or something, and banned membership in communist and socialist organizations, their publications and whatnot as well. And during World War I and World War II, while the state was imposing this wartime economy and taking control of all the social networks and whatnot, they also interned thousands of civilians that they designated as enemy aliens. So during World War I, this included a lot of Ukrainians, and then during World War II, it was Germans, Italians, and Japanese. And then in 1970, So those were temporary measures. And then in 1970, of course, we had the October crisis when the Quebec Liberation Front had kidnapped the British diplomat and a high-ranking Quebec minister who was assassinated. And so the Liberal government under Pierre Elliott Trudeau enacted the War Measures Act and basically imposed like martial law over the country, even though it was mostly restricted to Quebec and in particular Montreal. And there was about 456 people arrested, most without charge. And there was a lot of banning of publications and whatnot. So there was somewhat of a backlash against the use of the War Measures Act for this, not insignificant, but not really like a war type of situation in how the state dealt with the Quebec Liberation Front and its actions. And so there was discussion about revising this and making some kind of new legislation to deal with these types of national emergencies or threats to national security, but without invoking the War Measures Act. And in the late 1970s, there was, I think it was the MacDonald Commission, which was investigating the activities of the RCMP's kind of dirty campaign against the Quebec separatist movement in the 60s and early 70s. And so one of the recommendations out of that was to come up with some kind of new legislation so that they wouldn't have to use the War Measures Act. And they also recommend the separation of the intelligence, the security service from the RCMP. And that's eventually how we got CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. But it wasn't until 1988 that a new legislation was enacted, and that's the Emergencies Act, which replaced the War Measures Act. And it has different levels. Like there's one for like if there's a domestic emergency, like a terrible winter storm or flooding or natural disasters in this, then there's the public order aspect of the Emergencies Act, which could be used when, the national security is threatened by, sabotage or widespread civil disobedience or something, whatever. But this gave the state a lot of powers when it was going to be enacted. And the first time we saw it used was in 2022 against the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. And this gave the state the powers to, remove all the protesters, take their vehicles, and it was also they're also dealing with the other blockades at the Coutts border crossing and the Windsor border crossing to the U.S., which was costing billions of dollars because they blockaded those as well. But that's like the Emergencies Act. And then after 9/11, of course, as Elena talked about, we had the introduction of the new Anti-Terrorism Act in 2001. It was passed in December 2001, just a few months after the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And this gave the state fairly broad powers as a part of the criminal code now, without enacting an Emergencies Act or without, enacting any kind of emergencies legislation. And it covered a lot of different aspects. And it's basically a counterinsurgency law because it's not dealing with a war between states. It's dealing with these small groups. So it's basically a counterinsurgency law. And it covers a lot of aspects of a counterinsurgency. So it had preventative arrests for people who are suspected going to be committing some kind of offense. Then it had financial aspects so that their bank accounts and all their funding could be frozen, and immigration status and stuff like this. So it covered a lot of different aspects. There was sunset clauses in it for some of the aspects of the new legislation that the state probably felt would get the most public criticism. So there was a sunset clause of 3 to 5 years. and those actually lapsed. I think one of the governments tried to extend those sunset clauses, but in 2015 there was new legislation, the Combating Terrorism Act, which uh, basically uh, revamped some of those sunset clauses. And there was another one. I just look at my notes. Yeah, the Combating Terrorism Act was in actually it was in 2013, and there was a new Anti-Terrorism Act in 2015, which extended the preventative detention from 3 days to 7 days, and it also greatly expanded the powers of CSIS and empowered them to get these threat disruption warrants. So that because CSIS was originally only intelligence gathering, and they would make their reports and recommendations, and they had no powers to arrest or anything like that. That was one of the recommendations from the McDonald Commission and why CSIS was formed. And so it had a really specialized thing, and it couldn't arrest people. It had to work with the RCMP. But there was like, I mean, it's a whole other subject, but there was so much animosity between the RCMP and CSIS. It's kind of legendary. But so this 2015 revision of the Anti-Terrorism Act gave CSIS new powers to disrupt, uh, threats. So they could cancel people's travel plans or, just different things like that, cut their communications and stuff like that. Um, and all of this has greatly uh, expanded this national security state that was kind of in development over the years, but it's become much more entrenched now, I think. Um, and this terrorist designation list, they call it the listed entities. I mean, most of them are Islamist groups, and you have a sprinkling of far right white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys, Blood and Honor, the Three Percenters, and these seem like, I mean, not to downplay the threat of these groups and some of the actions that they've carried out, like murder and assaults and whatnot, but they're like one of the Three Percenters, because of some of the activities in the United States. But in Canada, it's been a very minor player. I mean, I think there was a few members in Alberta and whatnot. The Proud Boys. I mean, I think that designation came after the January 6th Capitol riot, but a very, very insignificant minor player in Canada. And so it really does seem like they're throwing in these groups, and so they can say, well, this isn't just an anti-Muslim category or a list, but you have these other groups. And the Samidoun listing is probably the most unusual of all the groups you can look at, because they don't take any action. Like they're not like the base, the neo-Nazi organization that does military training, and its members have been convicted for these attacks in the United States and whatnot. So it's definitely a very peculiar designation, I think. But I'll just talk briefly about the Indigenous experience with the state repression. So one of the things, after the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001 was passed, the RCMP created the Integrated National Security Enforcement Teams that are known as INSET. And they're in like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. I think that's where they have offices. So the first acts, like, so this group is, they're established because of this whole anti-terrorism, global war on terror. And yeah, their first targets were on Vancouver Island. The first operation they did was against the animal rights activists. And then the second one was against the West Coast Warrior Society. And they raided these people's homes and whatnot. So it does kind of show the real, the potential of where these acts can actually be applied. Now, in terms of like Indigenous resistance, to me, it's like interesting because on the one hand, you have had these very significant acts of resistance coming from Indigenous peoples, such as the 1990 Oka crisis and the 1995 Chapatan standoff or Gustafson Lake standoff. So both of these are like armed standoffs. Oka in particular had dozens of armed warriors and thousands of police and thousands of soldiers mobilized, but they never invoked the Emergencies Act for that. They just used a section of the National Defense Act to authorize the deployment of the military for this domestic policing operation. And then the same with the Chapatan standoff in 1995 in the BC interior. They didn't invoke the Emergencies Act. They just used a section of the National Defense Act to authorize the deployment of the Bison armored personnel carriers and the supplying of weapons and ammunition and whatnot. And even with, Shut Down Canada, I thought was a pretty strong action. It cost, tens of millions of dollars in, lost economic production, and the trains weren't running in some areas and whatnot. But again, there was no effort to use the Emergencies Act, and it just shows like I think it's interesting to look at it because it shows a reluctance on the part of the state to use this type of legislation or even designation against Indigenous resistance, even though according to their definitions of terrorism, some of these actions would fall under that. And in fact, you can look at in 2006, the Canadian forces, because they're involved in the invasion of and occupation of Afghanistan, they came out with a revised counterinsurgency manual as a part of their how to train their soldiers for these types of operations. And they had a draft version of the manual, and it had included discussion of the Mohawk Warrior Society as an example of an insurgent group that is an example of when a counterinsurgency campaign might be used. And there was a bit of a protest about that, and then the military removed any reference to Mohawk Warrior Society from the manual. It had reference to like Hezbollah and the Taliban, for example. So they removed the Mohawk Warrior Society, and then a few years later, they actually moved to make an official apology to Indigenous people because of that little slip up or whatever. But I think it shows that they don't have the political will to try to use this legislation on movements or parts of the population that they think is going to create significant, political problems for them if they try to use these types of designations. And I think that's kind of, it's an important thing to understand about these anti-terror legislation. And also, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001 was in many ways modeled on the British because it's also an advanced industrialized nation state that was having decades of counterinsurgency operations in Northern Ireland. And the British had passed the Prevention of Terrorism Act in the 1970s. And that had a lot of the same types of provisions that we see in the Anti-Terrorism Act. And so I think that's like an area that people should also look at in terms of understanding how this type of legislation is used in a counterinsurgency kind of like campaign, because that's really a model that a lot of these so-called Western democracies looked at, because Northern Ireland was always a laboratory for counterinsurgency, whether it's tactics or weapons and whatnot. But so the Prevention of Terrorism Act, I think, is very something that could be looked at. And also the British anti-terrorist legislations that came out in the 1990s, and how the social movements responded to this type of legislation as well. I think there could be lessons learned from that. But yeah, it's like the state doesn't need to use something like the Emergencies Act because it already has legislation that empowers it to disrupt social movements to a very high degree. I think this Palestinian solidarity movement is something that obviously the Western imperialist powers are very threatened by, and that's why you see this such outrageous demonization of the movement, and now the application of the anti-terrorism, terrorist list, entity list on a Palestinian prisoner solidarity group. I think shows how threatened the state is by this solidarity movement. I mean, it's unprecedented, I think, and definitely, I think it is going to be it's a really important movement that's going to have profound impacts because like tens of thousands of young people have been, I think, radicalized through this movement, and I think that's partly why we're seeing this type of state repression being brought down on it.
Thanks, Gord. That's great. Stick around for questions. Next, we're going to go to Zachary Williams from the East Van Workers Assembly.
Okay. So no matter what position they begin from, people's liberation movements must contend with a common enemy, the monopoly capitalist ruling class and the imperialist colonial state that manages and protects its collective interests. At different moments and different places, the state's violence and repressive power have appeared especially focused on one or another popular struggle. Think, for example, of the violence against striking and unemployed workers during the desperate struggles of the 1930s, armed confrontations between native land defenders and the military and paramilitary cops at Kanasatake and Gustafson Lake during the 90s, the 1,000+ arrests by Toronto riot cops during the G20 protests in 2010, or the current attempt to kill the Palestinian movement by making an example of Samidoun and poisoning the collective well with the legally, financially, and politically toxic designation of the so-called terror list. In each of these instances, we can see that the Canadian state didn't just pick their targets at random, but instead brought the hammer down because these struggles exposed major fault lines in the capitalist system. Whatever we might say about the particulars of their analysis, the ruling class rightly sees threats on all of these fronts as facets of a common struggle for working class and national liberation. As a result, the tactics they use to attack any of us can and will become part of their arsenal to attack all of us. For too long, activists in Canada have treated the workers' movement in isolation from the national liberation struggles of Indigenous peoples across North America and anti-imperialists around the world. We've been divided from one another, unable to see how our common enemy calls for unity, which has separated us on our individual fronts and led many down dead-end political paths. Recent events, however, I think force us to re-examine our assumptions and begin serious discussion and investigation into the situation we're facing. Almost simultaneously with the repression of the Palestinian movement and the crackdown on Samidoun, unionized workers in key industries have been almost under the radar, facing a growing assault by the government and big business on our democratic rights to strike and collectively bargain. Although the ability of workers to strike has been tightly controlled by the state for decades, the Liberal government's turn to unilateral back-to-work orders represents an escalation that puts even the labor movement's already weak status quo in jeopardy. Looking at the current situation in light of previous periods of labor struggle, I believe this moment offers a very stark choice for working-class militants. Either organize, take back the strike as a political weapon, and throw out the boss's lies about labor peace, or roll over and sink further into weakness and capitulation. So what are the conditions we're facing? According to the 2022 census, the unionization rate in Canada was just 28.7%, down from 37.6% in 1981. In BC, it's even worse, 28.6% compared to 43.3%. Whereas 4 decades ago, nearly half of BC workers were union members, now fewer than 3 in 10 are. The private sector, representing the core of the Canadian economy, is even worse, an abysmal 15%. While unionization does not necessarily translate to real organization, let alone class consciousness or militancy, it's a good baseline for looking at the state of the workers' movement, I think. It's also important because legally, these are the only people in Canada allowed to strike, which is the most important tool workers have at our disposal. So technically, the right to strike is recognized by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the Supreme Court upheld this in 2015 as part of our freedom of association. But in reality, this right is extremely narrow and entirely subject to the whims of the state and power of the employing class. Non-unionized workers are not permitted to strike at all. Workers who are unionized can only do so with official union approval and are not permitted to strike during the life of a collective agreement. They can't seize the initiative to respond in response to changing conditions because all strikes in BC are subject to a 72-hour notice. They can't strike to protest mistreatment in the workplace, strike in solidarity with other workers, resort to a strike without first bending over backwards to demonstrate that they've been bargaining in good faith to no avail, or strike to politically confront the policies and interests of the imperialist ruling class. And even in those rare circumstances when we are technically allowed to strike, unionized workers can be forced to pack up their picket lines just like that by a simple act of government. To violate such an order can subject the union, elected officers, and rank and filers to crippling financial penalties or even arrest. So I'm going to read from the Canadian Labor Code, Section 107. Quote, the minister, where the minister deems it expedient, may do such things as to the minister seem likely to maintain or secure industrial peace and to promote conditions favorable to the settlement of industrial disputes or differences. And to those ends, the minister may refer any question to the Canada Industrial Relations Board or direct the board to do such things as the minister deems necessary. So this is more than a loophole. It's a gloves-off guarantor of the bourgeoisie's power to do anything they deem necessary to maintain their class rule. And as Gord was talking about earlier, this is right in the labor code. It's not a special piece of legislation. In the past 6 months alone, AMFA mechanics at WestJet, Teamsters, railway workers, and ILWU and QP port workers have all faced orders from the labor minister at the behest of these companies, specifically designed to break their strikes. CUPW, who were legislated back to work by Parliament in 2011 and 2018, are likely next. In the grand scheme of things, none of these have been particularly militant strikes, but they've raised the specter of worker organizing in Canada's economically strategic transportation and logistics industries. In recent years, we've seen enormous repression against Indigenous movements blocking railways and ports, and vitriolic propaganda by bourgeois ideologues against the slightest hint of a slowdown to the insane flow of profits from resource extraction and commodity transport. Given this, it's not difficult to imagine what repressive steps this kind of open-ended language could authorize in a more serious atmosphere of class conflict. Although we could go back to the fiercest labor battles of the early 20th century, during which organized workers were routinely faced with imprisonment and deportations, open beatings by police and company thugs, and even large-scale armed confrontations. And I think it's important that we don't forget these experiences or foolishly pretend that this level of violent repression might never come again. It might be more useful to briefly look back to the 1970s, the last period of serious, protracted class struggles in this country, for insight into what state repression might look like for us if militancy again takes hold in the workers' movement, which I believe many of us desperately want to see happen. So the 70s were marked by economic crisis after decades of growth for the capitalist economies of Canada and the United States in the form of shrinking profit rates and growing competition from Western Europe and Japan. They were also marked by social crisis, as the waves of global revolution going on around the world began to find resonance in Canadian society. And I think crucially for us, a generation of combative young workers was entering the labor force. Compare 1960, in which less than 50,000 Canadians took part in work stoppages, accounting for 739,000 person days lost, with 1975, 15 years later, when more than 500,000 workers went out for nearly 11 million days. The conditions that opened the floodgates for these kind of worker struggles at the same time, however, prompted a new wave of political and economic repression. The experience of the Common Front public sector union strikes in Quebec over the course of the 70s is a case in point. The Common Front of the CSN, FTQ, and CEQ united over 200,000 public sector workers collectively bargaining with Quebec's reactionary liberal government. In 1972, the Common Front struck under the slogan, "We the Ordinary People." They demanded a minimum wage of $100 a week for public sector employees. The government responded to the strike with injunctions and back-to-work legislation. And to this legislation, union leaders were actually willing to accept it and recommend that their workers do go back, as long as the government would in turn agree to return to the bargaining table. But despite this conciliatory gesture, the state jumped at the opportunity to crush the movement and sentenced leaders from all three union confederations to prison sentences. The state's counterattack backfired, however, and instead of ending the strike, private sector unions across the province also went out. Workers fought in the street with cops, and factories and even entire towns were occupied by militant workers. The Common Front strike of 72 became the Quebec General Strike, which is still probably the most militant large-scale labor fight of the modern era in Canada. The general strike was eventually pushed back, and the experience left a deep impression on the ruling class. Over the course of the 1970s, the government would hack away at the capacity of the Common Front to engage in such militant action again, using both direct confrontation and legal maneuvers in order to repress the movement. This tactic of squeezing the unions culminated in 1982-1983, when the Social Democratic Party Québécois government tore up the existing contracts and demanded massive wage cuts across the public sector. This time, the repression focused more heavily on workers' livelihoods. They set daily fines for illegal picketers at $100 for workers, $5,000 for leaders, and $50,000 for unions. And in today's money, that would be $275, $13,500, and $135,000 for unions. And in addition to this, also gave themselves the power to fine, suspend, and fire striking workers at will. Today, the threat of economic ruin is the most pressing concern for most unions and workers looking to fight this rigged system. But all of the above are tactics that we still see. Draconian anti-worker laws, organized propaganda in the mainstream media, and if you've been following the CUPW strike, you can see the most absurd kind of news stories every single day about it. Police and company surveillance, targeted discipline and firings of worker organizers, clearing of picket lines and other actions, and even politically motivated arrests and trials to make public examples of militant labor leaders. So, in practice, the right to strike is no right at all. It's a calculated compromise. It's a legal measure by the ruling class to clamp down on real militant class struggle that actually criminalizes the strike in the vast majority of cases while pretending that it's doing the opposite. It puts class struggle in a box in order to contain it, to suffocate it. And every time we get too close to the edges and threaten to push beyond the limits of what the capitalist state is willing to accept, they clamp down, attack our organizations and leaders, and try to make the box even smaller. But this should not lead us to the conclusion that the struggle is hopeless or that we can avoid confrontation with the ruling class if we just toe the line. Because as we've seen, towing the line just means telegraphing our weakness and inviting further exploitation. So where do we go from here? In a way, the bosses have already shown us, I think. It's the political strike. Political strikes use the most important weapon of the working class, our direct control over production and distribution in the economy, to push beyond the limits of what the law says worker struggles can be. They raise issues that speak to the interests and needs of the whole class of oppressed nations, both in Canada and abroad, instead of being confined to the narrow workplace or economic concerns of a small number of workers. And by pushing against the constraints of the box they want to put us in, political strikes can also transform the fight against the boss into a fight against the state that backs up the boss's power. The situation we're facing right now, which is obvious collusion between monopoly capitalist corporations that force their workers into a corner and then call on the government to do their dirty work, ordering them back to work. This forces us to confront this reality. The ruling class is engaged in a political attack on the right to strike. So the next step we have to consider is whether we are ready to strike in order to defend and expand our right to strike, our ability to organize and fight. The Eastman Workers Assembly is currently building up capacity and talking with allies about how to organize and mobilize solidarity picket lines of non-postal workers to shut down Canada Post facilities should the Liberals once again bring down the back-to-work hammer. Even more importantly, many Cup W locals are now having similar conversations, except for them, it would be to defy this bullshit legal demand and continue the strike until victory. This in itself would be a political strike, and it will certainly come with repression and, depending on our level of unity and strength, possibly real consequences. But when the enemy raises the level of the conflict between us, they are unwittingly turning the strike into a living school of class struggle. At the end of the day, this is how we will develop, how we will grow our organizations and strategic capacities, how we will build our own united or common front of struggle, and how we can learn to best weather the storms of repression.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Before we move to questions, I wanted to first appreciate the breadth of the speakers' presentations and the overview of the soft and hard control of the state, really that allow the state to tactically target, surveil, label, charge, and deploy the military or the police against progressive movements, whether they're struggles for Indigenous self-determination, struggles against the legitimacy of the Canadian state to rule, or struggles against the legitimacy of the bourgeoisie to continue to clamp down on its exploitative labor practices. And really the chilling effect that this has had on movements overall, on our analysis, on our strategies, on our political horizons of oppressed and exploited people. But before we move to questions, we're going to hear from Ioannis from United in Struggle with 5 beginner ideas or proposals for principles, I should say, that can frame the way we view our response to repression. And then we'll have questions for the speakers.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into the weeds a little bit in terms of in the question period. So I'm excited about that, looking at some of the great content that came up in the discussion. But we did also want to kind of bring some concrete lessons from our own experience of organizing as United in Struggle, and also our collective roots in militant struggles over the years, and what we've learned from great revolutionaries. So we wanted to propose 5 principles to ground our resistance and response to repression. Principle 1 is that in all times and in all places, the support of the masses is the most important protection against state repression. The masses, and in our context, particularly the multinational working class and indigenous popular classes oriented toward liberation, are the material force that can contest the power of the imperialist bourgeoisie. It's the thing that they're really afraid of. So for the first principle is that we have to use the tools that we have for organizing, tools we've inherited from advanced movements, to build a mass base. And we really rely at United in Struggle on step-by-step organizing and the mass line. And the mass line is critical here because it guides how we articulate our politics. It's not conservatism. We have to be bold in our politics and push people's consciousness and be fearless in the face of our enemies. Maki baka huwag magtakot. Fight, don't be afraid, as our Filipino movement friends teach us. But it's also not adventurism. So articulating the most revolutionary and militant aspirations only exposes us to the state if we can't bring the masses with us. Principle 2 is that we need to build and practice collective leadership. And I'm not talking here about the snake oil of horizontalism, which is both never real and a barrier to getting organized. I'm talking about structured leadership based in collectives and committees, consciously training second, third, and fourth line leaders who can step in when existing leaders age out, move on, or are removed by state repression. Principle 3 is to put in place security practices that are consistent with the current level of repression and maybe a little bit more, but without falling into the trap of getting weird or paranoid in ways that alienate us and distance us from the masses. The watchword here is minimal exposure to the state, maximum exposure to the masses. And we have to keep in mind that there is no technical or technological solutions to the problem of bourgeois state repression. Only working class power can solve that problem. Principle 4 is that without getting sidetracked from our main task of organizing the masses, we should take advantage of all the civil and legal avenues open to us in resisting and contesting state repression. This includes legal system strategies, but especially consciousness raising, mass political campaigns, and prisoner support work when we face repression. And principle 5 is unite, don't split. Let's build unity across movements and struggles on the principle of standing together against repression. Don't pile on to groups that face repression, even if you don't agree with everything they stand for. Keep criticisms internal and principled. Don't use language that justifies repression. Don't divide targeted groups into, quote, real terrorists and unfairly designated, and call for the terrorist list to be scrapped. It is only and always has been an instrument of imperialism. So those are our 5 proposals for principles for resisting state repression.